welcome to this afternoon. Thank you very much to everyone who helped to organize this tribute that we're going to do for Professor Terblanche, who was the head of department for 20 years, from 1980 to 2000, and who passed away recently. A special welcome to his wife Anne, to his son James, to his brother Peter and his wife Lynn. Thank you very much for attending. Special welcome to our previous HOD, Professor Khan. Thank you very much for attending, and to many of the other professors and colleagues that we haven't seen for some time. Professor Moore, Professor Goldberg we see quite often, and Lance Mitchell, thank you very much for coming. Professor Gorman, there you are, I was looking for you. Thank you very much for being here. I think Pam Sanger is here. Is she not here? Okay. So I may have missed some people that have come through, but thank you very much for being here. What we're going to do for the next hour is Professor Groote is going to give us an input on the life and times and work of Professor Terblanche, and after that we will have space for anyone to make an input, give an anecdote, give their impressions, thoughts and memories of Professor Terblanche. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lydia, for hosting this very special occasion, and for the opportunity and the privilege to pay tribute to and to celebrate the life and the work of a remarkable man who led this department with great distinction for 20 years and had a profound influence on the practice of surgery in this country, in this continent, and worldwide. As we pay homage and reflect on Jean Terblanche's legacy, we do so with a deep sense of gratitude for his loyalty and his unwavering commitment to this department, this hospital, and this university. His was a surgical career distinguished by extraordinary accomplishments, international recognition, and innovative laboratory and clinical research projects. In his 20 years at the helm, he provided substantive and vigorous leadership in surgery, both nationally and internationally. And he motivated and led a superbly organized and highly productive department, which equaled the finest in the world and remains so today. In his prime, he was one of the most recognizable names in world surgery and was widely sought as a departmental visitor and as an international speaker. In fact, he was a visiting professor at no fewer than 43 universities and departments around the world. And he gave a raft of high-profile and invited eponymous lectures. His research and academic achievements were recognized internationally, as evidenced by the 10 honorary fellowships he was awarded. And he held high office as president of 9 international societies, colleges, and associations. And he was determined, principled, and clinically uncompromising when patient care was involved. As we reflect on John's journey, he was 12 when his family moved from Cape Town to Port Elizabeth, and he started Standard 6 at Grey High School in Mill Park in 1948. He was a school prefect in Matric in 1952, head of Vipen House at Grey, and he played first team rugby. However, his most outstanding achievement at school, as he occasionally would remind us, was on the shooting range. He was the school champion, rifle shot in standards 8, 9, and 10, as well as the provincial champion. Here in the photograph, receiving an award from the erstwhile Minister of Defence in 1952. John started medical school at UCT in 1953. By the time he was in 3rd year, he was playing for the varsity first 15 as a lock forward, in an exceptional team with some very talented players. A team which won the league competition in 1955, including the Grand Challenge Shield and Intervarsity. Those of you who are interested in rugby and knowledgeable will recognize some faces in the team. Dr. Louis Babro, who was the club chairman, and he was famous for his involvement in the 1937 Springbok tour to New Zealand. And in particular, what was interesting, he had the moral dilemma, because the first test was on Yom Kippur, and he was an integral part of the team. He was uncertain what to do, so he phoned the rabbi, his rabbi in Cape Town, who, with the wisdom of Solomon, solved the problem. He said, "My son, you're playing in Auckland on Yom Kippur, but it isn't Yom Kippur in Cape Town. Your synagogue's in Cape Town, please play." He did play, and in fact they won that test, and eventually they won the series. Just out of interest, because there's Dr. Bootle, and you want to know, the captain of the team was Dick Lockyer, who in 1960, this is 1955, in 1960, was part of the team that dismantled the All Blacks at Ellis Park. And Brian Pfaff played fly-off for the Springboks in 1956 at Sydney Cricket Ground, where they beat Australia. Basil Holmes played for Western Province. And just over there is an anaesthetist called Julian Biebeck, and we'll hear more about him in a little while. John graduated in medicine in 1958, and he's standing here in the photograph next to Peter Baker, who some of you will know, who became a well-known vascular surgeon in Cape Town. After completing his internship in 1959, John made two important decisions that would ultimately change and influence his life. His most important decision, and the most astute decision that he made, was when he proposed and married Anne in January 1960. A marriage that was to last for 63 years. This is exceptional, and I think we should give Anne a round of applause. The other decision was his early ambition to do surgery, and with remarkable foresight he applied for and was appointed to work as a researcher for Professor Chris Barnard for 18 months in the J.S. Murray lab, investigating profound hypothermia during cardiac surgery in the pig model, which was to be the basis of his CHM thesis. In addition, he also had to assist in the cardiac theatres at GSH. So his responsibility in theatre was to assemble and prime the bypass machine early in the morning, and then open the patient's chest and place the patient on bypass. Chris would arrive, do the necessary procedure, and then leave. John would take the patient off bypass, close the chest, and then special the patient through the night in the ICU. He told me he was required to phone Chris Barnard every 3 hours throughout the night with an update on the patient's blood gases and the patient's clinical progress. The CHM was typed by Anne and was awarded with distinction in 1964. John also passed his FCS in 1964, and he received the Douglas Gold Medal as the most distinguished graduate of the year. Out of interest, there are at least 2 other people in this room who are subsequent Douglas Gold Medal winners, one of whom is Professor Lydia Cairncross. Success is often determined by being in the right place at the right time. In 1965, John and his family left for the UK, where by serendipity he worked with Joe Peacock, who was a vascular surgeon in Bristol. But Peacock was interested in developing a pig model for experimental orthotopic liver transplantation, an arrangement which suited John perfectly because his pig work with Chris Barnard in Cape Town stood him in good stead, and in Bristol he perfected the technique for orthotopic liver transplantation with Joe Peacock and Ken Hobbs as co-authors in several of the studies. John returned to Cape Town at the end of 1967 and joined the department as a consultant, just at the time when some of the old guard, including Lane Forsyth and Bill Schuur, were retiring. In the second row is a young 35-year-old David Stein, who, David, thank you for being here today. Very sprightly at 90. John continued his big lab work. In the early 1970s, joined Stuart Saunders as a co-founder of the MRC Liver Research Center, a position he later shared with Ralph Kirsch, which resulted in a productive research, collaboration and partnership, ultimately producing over 40 highly cited papers. As he had established in Bristol, landrace pigs were the perfect model for experimental orthotopic liver transplantation. And John continued working in the lab, supervising Rosemary Hickman, David Dent, and Harold Swirl with their work. One celebrated pig was Percy, who underwent a liver transplant and was not expected to live much longer than 4 weeks. However, Percy survived and thrived. He had weighed 50 pounds at the time of the liver transplant, and when he died, eventually, 2 years later, he weighed over 700 pounds. His death was recorded as that of morbid obesity. An incidental and unusual occurrence in some pigs was the onset and death due to malignant hyperpyrexia when receiving a general anesthetic. This provided an excellent experimental model and led to the discovery of dantrolene as the drug of choice to inhibit the after effects of hyperpyrexia in humans. A publication which became a citation classic, cited more than 1,000 times. Important work. Another important clinical and research topic at the time was the attempt to save lives of patients dying of fulminant hepatic failure. A novel cross-circulation and exchange transfusion technique was developed to circulate the patient's blood through the liver of an anesthetized Chacma baboon, a procedure which saved lives and which resulted remarkably in 3 Lancet papers in the space of 5 weeks. This procedure caused some consternation when the night matron found an anesthetized patient and a baboon, which had been smuggled in, lying side by side on the operating tables in B2 Theatre downstairs. Chris Barnard, who could do no wrong, reassured the night matron and the medical superintendent, who had hurriedly arrived, that this was entirely ethical and in fact a life-saving procedure. John was appointed ad hominem full professor in 1973, and in his inaugural lecture in 1974, he gave tribute and expressed his gratitude to Professor Yanni Lowe. And in the lecture, emphasized the immutable values that underpin and shape the ethos, the moral values, the culture, and the code of sustained excellence in this department. John succeeded Yanni Lowe as the head of the division and the head of the department in 1981. And when this divisional photograph was taken 10 years later, in 1991, there were by then 40 consultant surgeons in general surgery, including 12 part-time surgeons and 7 professors in the division, of whom 3 were full professors and 4 were associate professors. An important development in the division under John's guidance and his vision in the mid-80s was the creation of separate and distinct specialty firms, so that HPB, vascular, colorectal, oncology, endocrine trauma, and ICU now became clearly defined entities which facilitated and enhanced clinical work, patient referral, registrar training, the development of technical expertise, and research. Rosemary was in charge of the Jan Esmeré, Rosemary Hickman, and a bright young man with film star good looks who persuaded John that mucus was the future, was appointed and led the mucus research program. I'm very glad that Anwar is here today. Terblanche always led from the front. He imbued the division with a sense of mission and purpose. He created the essential elements for an optimal research environment. He provided the leadership and clinical research expertise required and put a premium on learning advanced technical skills. This was achieved by establishing an effective organizational and administrative structure, and he personally supervised and participated in many of the projects. The HPB program in particular attracted a stream of international surgeons to the mecca of the highly sought after HPB training in Cape Town, with the fellows returning home later as converted disciples, spreading the gospel according to Terblanche and Bournemouth. John's own major research contributions were manifold, but he was best known internationally for his seminal work in portal hypertension and sclerotherapy for esophageal varices. His academic output was prodigious, with 246 publications, 110 invited book chapters, and he edited 4 books, and his magnum opus was the definitive work on hepatobiliary malignancy, which he edited in 1993 while on sabbatical with Bernard Lornat in Rennes in France. With a remarkable organization, the drafts were typed in Cape Town by Brenda Fine and Pam Sanger, and many of the illustrations were done here by Philippa Johnson. John dedicated this book to Anne and to Bernard Lornat, who taught him about the French way of life, which I suspect included cheese and wine appreciation. John's Lancet paper in 1983 on bleeding esophageal varices remains the most cited paper on the endoscopic treatment of portal hypertension, and is also the most cited South African clinical paper in the health sciences. The Bournemouth-Terblanche randomized controlled trial in Annals provided the evidence and ushered in the then new era of fiber optic endoscopic control of variceal bleeding. John's 2-part review of the management of bleeding esophageal varices in the NEJM remained the state-of-the-art paper for a decade. The clinical research in Cape Town positioned the department as a global leader in the treatment of bleeding esophageal varices. And Flip and John joined the distinguished list of portal hypertension pioneers, which included Whipple, Warren, Lebrecht, Starzl, and Roche. John and Flip were later joined on this list by Greg Stegman, who had come to Cape Town as a visiting international fellow before he pioneered and developed endoscopic variceal banding in Denver. John was delighted when we spotted Greg Stegman return 20 years later to give the 4th J.H. Lowe lecture. And Greg spoke about the influence John had on his own career. When John retired at the end of 2000, a festschrift in the SAJS was dedicated to him, and the editorial commended his substantial surgical and academic legacy, a legacy to be remembered, cherished, preserved, and nurtured. After retirement, we saw John annually at the Department of Surgery Research Day for the eponymous Terblanche lecture, and it was a particular pleasure to host him and other distinguished surgical retirees in 2012 at the inaugural Charles Saint dinner, which celebrated the centenary of the founding of this medical school. A cornerstone of John's life was his continued love for his family, and was a constant supporter of his career and a gracious hostess to the many visitors, ranging from distinguished international guests to junior trainees invited to dine at the Terblanche home. Our thoughts at this time are with Anne and his children Michelle, James, Michael, Christopher, their spouses and grandchildren, who can all be comforted by these special memories and can be proud of a remarkable and inspirational father and husband. The success of this department over the last 103 years is in large part due to the appointment of effective leaders such as John Terblanche, who understood and promoted a culture of achievement and success and incorporated these essential ingredients into our surgical DNA. The Terblanche surgical legacy is set to endure, and we remain indebted to him for his vision, his values, his vigorous leadership, his innovative scientific contributions, and the standards of excellence he practiced and demanded. His influence was immense and will last well beyond his physical presence.
Thank you very much, Professor Cricker, for that walk through history and for that beautiful tribute to John Terblanche. Thank you very much. I'd like to open for contributions. I'm not sure if I can ask Professor Bornemann first, if you would like to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you, Lydia. Well, I think Jack has said it all, and it really outlines the wonderful journey that we experience with a remarkable man. From my side there's very little doubt that serendipity often plays a major role in one's working career. In my case, a critical phase, or the fork in the road, is when Raoul de Villiers, who I studied surgery at Bloemfontein, facilitated my appointment here at this Department of Surgery, and that was in 1970. And the good fortune that I was appointed as a consultant in Professor Terblanche's firm. It's very interesting when my friends in Bloemfontein heard that I'm coming down to Cape Town. They were quite surprised and to a certain extent also shocked. They said to me, "What are you going to do down there amongst those liberals and the communists?" Well, I didn't have much to say. I said, "Oh, I'm going to do some missionary work down there." By that time, Raoul de Villiers himself returned to Cape Town, and then he became a consultant with Professor Janilo, who was then head of the department. I will never forget the day I first met John. We had just arrived in Cape Town, and Raoul de Villiers and his lovely wife Sinead invited us for a dinner at the old Spur in Rondebosch, and that was just the evening before before I started to work in the department. And in walked John Terblanche and Anne, and with a big smile he said to me, "Welcome to Cape Town, welcome to the Department of Surgery." And he, with a big smile, took his bleep. In those days we didn't have cells. He said, "Here you are, my young man. From now on, you're going to be 24 hours on call and 7 days of the week," because we were looking after all the patients with variceal bleeds, and we were in the middle of the sclerotherapy trials, which Jake has alluded to. Well, the rest is history, and I'm not going to repeat what Jake said. John was a tremendous mentor to me. I played a pivotal role in the development of my academic career. He was supportive, and he knew how to push you in the right direction. He had the knack to say, "Well, this man, I think he needs to go this way," and so on. I think many people can agree with that. And then, of course, there's Anne. What a wonderful, supportive wife Anne was for John. And what a gracious host during all those departmental functions that you had at your lovely home, with scrumptious meals and wonderful company. And from a personal note, we will never forget that time when I went for a sabbatical in Edinburgh, when you offered to look after our dog Tabby, and for that we will be ever grateful. Once again, sincere condolences to you and the family. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Welcome, Mrs. Terblanche, and thank you, Lydia. Thanks everybody for the opportunity to say a few words. And it's really special for me to see so many of my mentors in this room. It really is a meaningful moment from that point of view. I don't have anything kind of important to say. Just a few recollections of my interactions with Professor Terblanche, JT as he used to be called. I knew Terblanche as a medical student, and then I was an intern in his firm for 4 months. And Rob Sabis and I were interns together, and we had Paul Goldberg and Kurt Goldberg were 2 registrars. We used to call them the Goldberg twins, although there's no relationship whatsoever. It was interesting to reflect on how John Terblanche was a very, very powerful presence in the clinical workspace. He often wasn't there because he was such an inveterate traveler. He would be everywhere, and he would appear once every few weeks, it seemed. And when he appeared, everything went into a buzz, and he led by presence, but also by a certain degree of fear. Okay, things have changed a lot in terms of leadership structures from those days. But when Terblanche was coming, you could see the registrars would start to get really panicky as to what they're going to do. They came dressed with ties and clean white coats. He had a thing about clean white coats had to be buttoned up. And things started to happen on the buzz. And Jake and Flip were a little bit more anxious around what was going on in the ward. Complications managed to disappear into other wards at the time. all those kind of things. And then when I came back as a registrar, I was struck that actually he changed quite a lot, and he was much more mellow in the last sort of 5 or 6 years of his time, and it was a very fatherly role that he had with the department as opposed to a domineering, controlling one. And another anecdote I remember is that the Terblanche family had a very generous routine of every year that invite the junior consultants to have supper at their house in Rondebosch as a gesture of generosity towards us, because we did all the work, just look at us do it. And Professor Terblanche and his family would serve us, and they wouldn't be part of the meal, just there would be 10 or 15 of us with our partners, we'd have dinner in the house. Mrs. Terblanche is a very talented painter, and the rumor had it that there was a portrait of Professor Terblanche in the naked flesh in the house. And the rumor was there, and it was the challenge of the evening to find the room in which this painting was displayed without being too overt about it. And I think the first time we went, Andy Nicol was the first person to allegedly see it. He kept on going into room by room, trying to find the bathroom and finding the wrong room. The last anecdote I remember was going to an international congress in Vienna, where I was a very young surgeon, and Professor Terblanche was an invited speaker. And I was struck by what a fantastic PR agent he was for this hospital, this department, and this university. Because you go to national meetings and people present papers and talks, and there was a couple of questions, and the people that talk all the time. John Terblanche put his hand up all the time, and all he did was tell people what Jake and Flip would do in Cape Town. Yeah. And by that, he really championed, obviously indirectly, his practice, but really he was a very strong advocate of the careers of people that work with him, and of the reputation and the functionality of our department. And I was struck by how proactive he was in doing that. He wasn't a silent, passive member. He kept on saying to people how good the service was here, and he did that very well. And those are my key memories of Professor Terblanche.
Thank you.
I see Professor Miller's joined us as well, and Professor Hudson I saw come in just now. Lance, would you like to say something? No? Oh, sorry. Okay.
And Jake, thank you very much for that, Philip. I can't add anything to what was said, but I've had some experiences with Prof, and I'm just going to take one or two of them and share them with you. So when I came here in 1979, I was terrified of Prof, 1980. And I hardly saw him except when he sent for me. So I used to go down from the lab to go and see him. I had to wait. And then I was called in, and he would tell me what he wanted to say, and I would leave. I gradually got to know him. And I did say at my inaugural that for my first 15 years, he looked like this, and 5 years later, when he mellowed, he smiled. And I was in England when Prof was doing a sabbatical at one of the London hospitals. And he kept very much in contact with me. And one day I told him I've had an abstract accepted for a meeting in Lancaster. And he said, "Oh, I'm coming to that meeting. I'm going to have lunch with you." And I was absolutely terrified, because I was going down with a group of Geordies. And those Geordies never failed to express themselves both from their anterior and posterior orifices wherever they were. So I started priming these Geordies and saying to them, you got to behave. This is my boss in Cape Town. And he said, all right, because our boss in England, Professor Adrian Allen, was a very easygoing guy. Anyway, when I got there, at lunchtime I was very relieved to see Prof with all the big boys, you know, the big professors from all the hospitals, and they were going to have lunch together. The Geordies and I took our lunch and we went and sat outside under a tree. And I was feeling really good that Prof had forgotten about having lunch with me until I saw him approaching us. And I tell you, it was a real shocker for me. And he came there and he sat with us on the grass. And it wasn't the Prof I knew, you know. He was so easygoing, cracking jokes with them, tapping them on the shoulder and saying, so is this guy behaving himself? If he doesn't behave himself, you just write to me and tell me. And when he left, and they turned to me and said, what were you so worried about? He's such a canny bloke. and that was one incident. The second one was that we used to have surgeons training here in microsurgery with Gert Engelbrecht. And one day, one of the female surgeons walked down this passage and she saw me in my office and she came in there. I'm not going to mention her name. And she said to me, there's lots of empty offices here. So I said, yes. She said, can I have one? I want to do my write-up and I've got some things to do. She was a surgeon, trainee surgeon. So I said to her, you've got to ask the powers that be. That's all I said to her. And then she left. Now I was walking down the hospital corridor and I saw Prof coming towards me like this. He said, you, Mo, who gave you the right to give one of my offices to somebody? I got the shock of my life. Now, I couldn't even open my mouth and say to him, you know, Prof, I never offered her anything. I said, go to the powers that be. I thought she'd come to Pam Sana and come to you. I couldn't say that. Do you know what I said? I said, Prof, she was so beautiful, I couldn't say no. And then I said to myself, now what have I done? And guess what? He actually laughed. And he turned around and he just shook his head. He came to the Thursday lab meeting and he said to Rosemary, this guy's giving my offices away to beautiful women. And so later we developed a relationship, and Eugene is right. When we met at international conferences and things, he was very warm. He used to call me and he used to actually say to people, meet my son. That's what he used to actually say. I couldn't sort of, you know, reconcile the two personalities. But in his last few years, I was able to tease him. That is after he retired. Because at an international conference, he used to wait for the mic and he'd say, hi, John Terblanche from Cape Town. And then he used to say what he wanted to say. So whenever I saw him, I said, John Terblanche from Cape Town. And he's just like, you, Mal, you get a hiding. Thank you very much.
I'm not really well, I'm definitely not a general surgeon, but my mentor really was Sid Simons. But my memories of John Terblanche were first as a third-year student in pathology, and he showed me how he took a great interest in his patients, because there was a post-mortem. And he came round when we were students, and he pored over that open post-mortem for about 20 minutes. So clearly this was one of his patients that had succumbed. So you learn from that. My next was, I was an intern, the only white intern actually, at the Somerset Hospital in 1973. And David Steyn was there as a consultant, and John Terblanche was appointed to take over Somerset Hospital. And I think he had a remarkable effect on Somerset Hospital. And I was just a surgical intern. I assisted him with a number of cases. But I remember one particular case was a parathyroidectomy. And I think Dr. Dyer was the histopathologist, and we sent up a little bit of something yellow, waited for 20 minutes, came back fat. Another 20 minutes of dissection and a little bit of sent up, came back fat. And after about 4 or 5 of these, John Terblanche said, I'm getting fed up with this neck. And he pulled the retractor and out popped a tumor about the size of a pigeon's egg. So I thought that was very good. And of course, he was a mentor when Dell and I were sent to Pittsburgh to learn about liver transplants in 1985, and subsequently, of course, mentored both of us in our transplant service. That's really, and he continued in that respect. And Dell also is, of course, my mentor in that respect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. If there's no one else that would like to make a contribution, anyone else? Then, sorry?
I can tell us.
Oh, please.
I don't know how the limelight, which I am, but I've got some really lovely stories about John. We had a very good relationship. And he would go on sabbatical every 7 years. So his first sabbatical was with Tom Starzl in Denver, and then went to the Royal Free with Ken Hobbs and Andy Burrows and Dame Sheila Sherlock. And then in '93 he went to Rennes to work with Bernard Renoir. The interesting thing is, so in the PAC in South Africa, the secretary was Barney Desai, and he left South Africa because he was being harassed politically, and he moved to London, where he worked as an advocate, but was described for the PAC. Barney drank a lot, and was admitted to the Royal Free with bleeding varices while John was there. And they attempted to control it endoscopically. They couldn't, and they were about to operate on Barney Desai and do a devasc on him. And they did a ward round, and Ken Hobbs was planning the surgery. He introduced John Terblanche to Barney Desai. This is the South African surgeon, his name is Terblanche. Barney was terrified that he might treat and come under the care of an Afrikaner. He just escaped from South Africa. And in fact, John Terblanche did sclerotherapy and controlled the bleeding, and he didn't need surgery. Fast forward to 1994, Barney Desai comes back, he's in Parliament, and he's doing his maiden speech in Parliament. And in the middle of the speech, he has a massive hematemesis. The story is it was over Julius Malema, but that's not, that hasn't been authenticated. And as he's being rushed out in an ambulance, he says, "Take me to John Terblanche." And he was brought here. John was busy, so I had to scope Barney Desai and control the bleeding. But it was very interesting in the ward who arrived, in particular Patricia de Lille. And when John Terblanche heard that Patricia de Lille was in the ward, he rushed down, and it was incredible to see the Terblanche magic at work. And what he was trying to do was trying to get money Patricia de Lille for surgical research. That was really sort of a lovely story. Anwar mentioned John's flying. He probably went overseas once a month. And there were rapid visits. Yvonne can corroborate that. He would leave on a Thursday and he'd be back on a Monday morning. And he'd spoken in Paris or Chicago. These were fast visits. The tickets were always sponsored by the host department, and John either flew business class or first class. And he had a particular seat in the plane, 1A, that was the Terblanche seat. He was a particularly pernickety man on the plane in that he complained incessantly about the quality of the wine and the food. And the poor CEO, Mr. Myberg, would get a letter on Tuesday morning from John about something that he was unhappy with. Myberg retired quite soon after that, or left, and it was said that because of the Terblanche dossier and file, it was that thick, he just couldn't take it anymore, and that was why he left the SAA. But the upshot was that John was one of 5 people in South Africa that got a lifetime platinum card, which allowed him free travel thereafter. I think he went to New Zealand to visit Michelle. Anyway, there are a lot of stories, but they all were funny stories about John.
Thank you very much. So, I think, I'm not sure if anyone from family would like to say a few words before I close.